It started like any other quiet morning on the ranch. The dew clung to the grass like secrets kept too long, and the rising sun cast its golden light through the ancient limbs of the oaks and sycamores that had stood tall on this land for over 2 centuries. My family's ranch, nestled deep in the folds of the valley, had always been a place of peace, an inheritance not just of land, but of legacy. My great-great-grandfather had cleared some of these fields by hand, but he'd left the trees untouched, believing, as we all did, that the land had a soul, and the trees were its memory. I had noticed Karen before, in the way one notices a storm cloud forming at the edge of a clear sky. She moved into the development that had crept its way up to the eastern boundary of my property, just one of many prefab monstrosities with matching mailboxes and law regulations stricter than the U.S. Constitution. While the others mostly kept to themselves, Karen had a way of inserting herself into things that didn't concern her. It started with complaints about the roosters, then the smell of manure. She once called animal control on my old hound for barking at a raccoon. But it was when she started talking about aesthetic standards and neighborhood continuity that I knew things might get ugly. I came back from the feed store that afternoon to find a half-dozen trees on the southeastern edge of my ranch felled, ancient cottonwoods and black walnuts hacked apart like weeds. Chainsaws still hummed as 2 hired workers dragged brush into a pile. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe a utility crew got lost. But then I saw her, Karen, arms crossed, supervising like she was orchestrating a symphony. When I confronted her, she gave me that tight-lipped smile, the kind you might give a child who didn't understand something simple. These trees were violating wall line of sight policies, she said. You've been warned in the community letters. I was stunned. Community letters. This isn't part of your community. This is private land, has been in my family since 1817. She didn't blink. It's adjacent to the community. Which means it affects property values. I nearly lost my breath. So you thought you'd just come onto my property and cut down trees older than your whole damn neighborhood. Her chin lifted. You had your chance to comply. I did what any person with a respect for law and land would do. I called the sheriff. By the time the deputies arrived, Karen was already spinning her narrative. He's letting the land become a fire hazard. We had no choice, she said, gesturing dramatically to the stumps like they were smoldering volcanoes. The sheriff wasn't impressed. But it was when Chief Dalton, head of the local tribal preservation office, arrived that everything changed. Dalton, a stoic man with deep roots in the region and a sharp mind for history, stepped from his truck and took one long look at the carnage. His silence was louder than any siren. He paced slowly, running his fingers along one of the freshly cut stumps, whispering something under his breath in his native tongue. He then turned to Karen and asked, "Who gave you permission to alter this land?" "I don't need permission," she said, a scoff in her voice. "This is a safety issue. The law supports it." Dalton's jaw tightened. "You just committed a crime on registered protected land." Karen blinked. "What are you talking about?" He pulled out a folded document from his coat. It was a historical designation map, one I'd seen before, though I'd forgotten just how far the boundaries extended. Turns out, the trees Karen had cut stood right on a known ceremonial grove, land officially registered under state and federal tribal protections. My family had been stewards of it for generations, and though I'd never filed to have it fenced or marked, the legal status had never changed. Dalton radioed the county office, and within the hour, a state historical officer showed up, followed by a ranger and a deputy district attorney. Karen's face began to change color like a chameleon in a heat lamp, first red, then pale, then a sickly green when the ranger read her rights. "You are being placed under arrest for the destruction of federally protected heritage land," he said calmly, snapping the cuffs on her like it was routine. To him, maybe it was. To me, it was justice wrapped in quiet disbelief. Her protests came loud and fast. "You can't arrest me. I was protecting the neighborhood. I didn't know." "That's not a defense," Dalton said flatly. "You trespassed, hired contractors, and destroyed protected trees. Ignorance isn't immunity. As they led her to the squad car, she thrashed, shouted that she'd sue, that the law would back her, that I'd be sorry. But the only sound that lingered was the wind moving through the trees that remained, almost mournful, almost grateful. After the dust settled, I walked with Dalton to the edge of the grove. He told me the trees she'd cut were part of a sacred site, a place used by his ancestors for generations. My family had always known the land was special. My great-grandfather had built a simple stone marker nearby, which now sat overgrown in the weeds. We stood there in silence, the weight of history between us. You've done well, he finally said. Not many would have kept this place safe all these years. I nodded, unsure what to say. I didn't always know what was here. But I always felt it. He smiled, thin and true. That's enough. Karen was released on bail 2 days later, but the charges stuck: trespassing, destruction of protected land, and violation of environmental codes. The law tried to distance itself from her immediately, denying all responsibility. Meanwhile, Dalton helped me file for reinforcement of the land's federal designation, and with his help, we installed markers, signs, and cameras to make sure this never happened again. But the stumps remained, stark against the earth-like scars. I spent the next week planting seedlings in their place, native trees, the same species that had stood there before, donated by the tribal council. It would take another 100 years before they reached the majesty of what had been lost, but it was a start. Because some things, like legacy and land, are worth protecting, even from people like Karen. When the sun rose over the rolling fields of my family's 200-year-old ranch, I never expected that by sundown, it would feel like a part of our history had been stolen. The gnarled old oaks that lined the northern pasture, some of them planted before my great-great-grandfather ever set foot on this land, had been part of our family legacy for generations. They weren't just trees, they were boundary markers, windbreakers, natural habitat, and more than anything else, living witnesses to our past. I'd always told my kids, these trees remember more than any of us ever could. That morning, the chainsaws woke me up before the rooster did. It was a jagged, unnatural sound, one that doesn't belong on a quiet ranch morning. I slipped on my boots and ran toward the noise, past the barn, over the ridge, and straight into what looked like a massacre. Karen from the WA, still wearing her pristine tennis whites, was standing with 2 workers in orange vests. Her arms were crossed like she'd just executed divine justice. Branches were already strewn across the field like corpses. One of the oaks had already been felled, a century of growth severed in minutes. What the hell are you doing? I shouted, my voice cracking with disbelief. And fury. She barely blinked. You were warned. The WA bylaws don't allow unregulated vegetation that obstructs the uniform appearance of the neighborhood. I nearly laughed, except it felt like I might cry instead. This isn't a neighborhood. This is private ranch land. These trees are on my property. Karen pointed to a laminated document with all the smugness of someone who'd just caught you violating an imaginary rule. You fall under the extended jurisdiction of Section 12 after the boundary vote last year. You're in violation. That boundary vote was something the WA had tried to push through when a few new developments started encroaching near the old ranch lands. Most of us had protested, some of us hadn't even known it was happening. But Karen had wormed her way into leadership and claimed the vote had passed. I never signed anything. I never agreed to let a homeowners association dictate what I could do on land that had been in my family before the state even issued titles. I pulled out my phone and called the sheriff, but while I waited, the workers kept going. Another tree started to whine under the blade, and I felt physically sick. These weren't just trees. My grandfather had carved initials into one of them. One was the tree I proposed to my wife under. Another had a rope swing that my daughter had grown up using. By the time Chief Arriaga arrived, 2 more trees had been taken down. He parked his cruiser and walked toward the scene with the kind of measured authority that made people nervous without him having to say a word. Karen, however, didn't flinch. Good morning, Chief. I was just explaining the jurisdictional issue to Mr. Merrick. He's out of compliance. Chief Arriaga didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked past her to where the old oak stumps were still weeping sap. He knelt beside one, brushed his hand across the rings, and looked back at me. Didn't the county mark this parcel as heritage protected back in 2008? He asked. I nodded. Got the documents in the house. My family registered it under the Historic Tree Preservation Act. These trees are protected under state conservation law. Karen tried to interject, but the chief held up a hand without even looking at her. I saw the signs. Metal plaques, county issued. You tore those down too. One of the workers shifted uncomfortably. They were already kinda bent. Then you knew, Arriaga said. He turned to Karen. You authorized this. She lifted her chin. I was acting in the HOA's best interest. The bylaws grant us oversight authority. If he disagreed, he should have appealed through proper channels. The WA has no jurisdiction over heritage protected land, especially not when it's under state conservation designation. What you've done here isn't just a civil matter, it's criminal damage to protected environmental property. Karen's face went pale. You can't be serious. Arriaga's jaw tightened. I'm dead serious. You violated state conservation law and trespassed. You authorized the destruction of protected trees on private property. You're under arrest. The sound of handcuffs clicking around her wrists was more satisfying than I'd like to admit. The two workers weren't charged. They had been misled and stopped their work immediately after the chief explained the situation. Karen, on the other hand, kept arguing even as she was placed in the back of the cruiser. You're making a mistake. You'll hear from my lawyer. Yeah, Arriaga said, slamming the door. He can meet you at the station. The aftermath was messy, to say the least. I had to file paperwork with the county and the state, hire a forestry expert to assess the environmental damage, and begin the long process of restoration. The stumps remained like scars in the field, brutal reminders of how quickly arrogance and entitlement can destroy something beautiful. But I wasn't alone. The community rallied. Not the WA, of course, but the people who'd been here for decades, people who respected the land. They brought meals, helped clean up, even contacted local news outlets. A few environmental journalists picked up the story, and it went semi-viral for a while. Karen destroys historic trees, gets arrested, which felt like the closest thing to justice we could get at the time. Karen tried to sue me for defamation, but the judge dismissed it faster than she could explain her version of the boundary vote. She was removed from the WA board shortly after, and the remaining members went quiet for a while, perhaps realizing that this had gone much too far. As for the ranch, we're working to restore it. I planted new oaks in the soil where the old ones once stood. They won't be the same, and they won't see as many seasons as their predecessors, but they're a start. We've added new signs, bigger this time, made of metal and stone, not just wood and bolts. Signs that say, protected land, heritage site, trespassers will be prosecuted. But also, welcome, respect the land. Because that's what it's about in the end. Respect. For nature. For history. For things that were here long before us and will be here long after. Karen never understood that. And maybe she never will. But my trees did. And the earth they grew from remembers.